You're listening to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy, and today we'll be talking to Sydney Bassard, founder of the Listening SLP, as part of our Dyslexia Awareness Month series. We talked to Sydney about the role of speech-language pathologists in the reading science movement. We can't wait to talk with Sydney today.
Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast. Today, we can't wait for this conversation because our guest started her journey as an SLP, speech language pathologist, after seeing her brother struggling with dyslexia. She believes in advocating within our communities so that educators and parents can be informed and actualize reading science into practice. So I'm not sure what is more noble than that. Right, Melissa?
Right. Seriously. And I also feel like we're here with an old friend, Sydney Bassard. We found each other on some social media, all of the social media, I think, at some point. She's also known as the Listening SLP. So she's amazing. Look her up if you haven't found her. And she is a certified speech language pathologist. She works with people who are deaf and hard of hearing and those with literacy challenges. And not only does she have a clinical practice, but she also engages in research, which is super cool and exciting. And we can't wait to pick her brain about. And she'll talk to us about the role of the SLP in communities, schools, and most importantly, with students.
Yeah. So Sydney, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Good. Thank you both. That was a really flattering introduction. But thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to get to chat with you both today.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad that you're here. And we'd like to start with you just sharing a little bit about yourself, how you became a speech language pathologist, or SLP, as we will abbreviate for today's conversation at times.
Yeah. So my path to becoming an SLP is really unconventional. Most people go into becoming an SLP by getting a bachelor's in communication sciences and disorders, or whatever their university calls it. But I actually started my undergrad thinking I wanted to be a pharmacist, and I was dead set on becoming a doctor until I took organic chemistry, and it said, girl, you are in the wrong space. This is not for you.
That's the one that does everyone in.
Oh man. It definitely did me in. And around that time, that's when my brother got diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD. And I was kind of in a crossroads. I knew that I didn't want to be a pharmacist anymore, but I wasn't really sure what else I wanted to do. So I ended up getting a job, and I actually worked at Linda Mood Bell Learning Processes, the center local to where I am, for a couple of summers. And I really liked it, but I did not want to go become a teacher, only because I would have had to start all over again with college. So I found public health, and I got my bachelor's of science in public health. I went back and took that organic chemistry class, and I passed it second time.
Yes. We love that resilience and determination. Yeah. Great work, perseverance.
Thank you. And so then from there, I found out that the University of South Carolina was one of few schools that allows people that have a non-background to start their program and take some leveling courses pretty quickly. So I applied and I ended up getting admitted. And then that's just kind of like how my journey as an SLP started, went to grad school, and then ended up working clinically.
Very cool. I'm wondering, before we jump into our real conversation today, we are highlighting dyslexia this month because it's October and it's Dyslexia Awareness Month. And you just mentioned that your brother was diagnosed with dyslexia. Is there anything else you wanted to share about your story with your brother?
Yeah. So my brother's story is kind of unique in the sense, well, it's not unique in a certain sense, and it's unfortunate. He did not get diagnosed until he was going into the 6th grade, and he had always kind of struggled with reading. Even talking with my mom, if you ask her, she had to spend a lot of time with him, not just with reading, but in doing his homework, lots of things that were missed. And if you look at the area we grew up in, it was pretty middle-class American environment. And we were one of one of the few Black families. And he just kind of went under the radar, and not in under the radar, like he did well in class, like he got labeled as a behavior issue, where there were other kids in his class that also presented with very similar profiles, and they were being diagnosed or they were getting medication to kind of help with their ADHD symptoms. And so I think once he got that diagnosis, it was, I think, a little bit of a relief for him. But I know from our family, it was a lot of explanation as to, okay, well, this is kind of a little bit of the why he functions the way he does and how it's a little bit different. And we had to make some adaptations. We had to really educate ourselves to learn a lot more about what dyslexia was. But when you look at who's out there and who's educating people, you don't see a lot of people of color. You don't see a lot of Black people leading that charge. And then even more so, you don't see people leading the charge with parents. People are leading the charge with teachers. We are leading the charge with educators, but we are not leading the charge with the people who go home with these children every single day. And those are the people that really need to be educated on what this looks like in day to day. It's great to know what it looks like in the academic setting, but how is this impacting our life? We know it impacts when you're looking at job applications, having to fill out medical information, when you're going to decide healthcare. All of those things are really impactful, big life events. And yet we're only talking about the small portions of, getting kids to be able to decode words and reading comprehension within the classroom, when there's so much more to dyslexia and what that experience looks like.
That's so important. I think sometimes we're so focused on we need to get the children what they need, or we need to get the student what they need. But really, it's stepping back and looking at the whole picture is something that is so important. And I think you have that bird's eye view. So we're really glad that you're here to have this conversation with us today.
So we're going to jump into a conversation around speech language pathologists. We've actually talked to a few parents who were like, yes, speech language pathologists are so helpful. And so Lori and I had been wanting to talk a little more about, for those in teachers, but also parents who might not even know what a speech language pathologist does. We really wanted to jump into that. So we know how important you all are to schools, but even outside of schools, and not only helping students with dyslexia or with specific, speech and language, what you typically think of as speech and language. I don't even know what we call it. Disorders. Is that the right
disorders,
word?
deficits.
I was going to say deficits, not sure. That's all right. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. But also in the reading science, beyond, even for students who are just, maybe just a little behind in reading or struggling to read, how helpful a speech language pathologist can be. So anyway, all that to say, let's start from the very beginning. How would you just define the role of a speech language pathologist to someone who's never heard this term before?
Yeah. So you can think of us as communication experts. We go to school to be specifically trained in helping individuals across the lifespan with communication. We also do feeding and swallowing as well, just depending on the setting that you're working in. And so SLPs can work with people from birth all the way up until death. It's really a wide range and scope of practice, kind of based on what people do. But when thinking about pediatrics and in the school setting, we're primarily focusing on two areas. So we have speech, and the way that we can think about speech is the production of how you're producing sounds. What does that sound like? Is it clear? Sometimes we might also be looking at voice within that as well, like your vocal quality. And then fluency is another area for people that might be stutterers and, they're not always able to get their words out as clearly as they may want them to be. So that's kind of the speech component. So when we're thinking of those kids that we call them articulation errors, have those, that's generally where we're seeing, where they're making those substitutions or their sounds aren't always exactly as we would want them to be. Then the other side of our job, which is where literacy ties in some with articulation, but it really ties in a lot more with language. And so language is how you're using those words that you have acquired. We can think of language in a couple of different ways, but two broad categories is receptive language, which is your understanding. How much are you taking in and how much are you fully understanding that? And then we have expressive, which is how much are you putting out? And then we have other features of language that all kind of go into that, such as your prosody or like your intonation that we look at and your rate of speech. All of those kinds of things factor into understanding and producing a message too.
That was such a helpful definition. I feel like we throw around the term SLP all the time, and I guess I thought about like a merger of the two of those, but not as clearly or as succinctly as you just articulated. So thank you.
Yeah. And I never think of it like that. I love when you mentioned like the birth to death, right? Like you can, that just kind of blew my mind when I heard about it, because I always think the school setting.
Yeah. Huge scope of practice.
Yeah. Fun fact. I actually, I had some speech, I don't know if we called them classes. I don't think we called them classes, but I got pulled out for speech when I was in kindergarten and first grade. And it was like such a quick fix.
Same, Melissa. Same here.
Yeah. It was the like g and k sounds that I struggled with. And I mean, I don't really remember it I remember going, but I don't remember too much. I just remember being like, oh, great. We got it. You're good to go.
Oh, I remember going. I remember like holding a mirror in front of my face and like looking and practicing. And then I remember really loving like getting out of like, oh, you get to do something special. Like it felt like such a special time, you know, like, oh, I get this one-on-one attention with this person who's going to help me do this thing better. Awesome. Well, okay. So let's transition into the role of the SLP. Let's start like with the community, because we know you have such an important role in the school, in the community, you know, with our students, with everyone, as you just shared, like from birth till, you know, I hate saying death, but birth till death. I feel like we should say like birth to 125. Like let's choose the age of the oldest person and let's say that.
That sounds better.
It sounds better.
Can go
birth to 120. That's what I'm going to say from here on out, Sydney. But I think maybe let's start to think about the role of the SLP in the community. Can you kind of share what the role of the SLP is for us in the community setting?
Yeah, so it really just kind of depends. We have some SLPs that do private practice. There's some that work for nonprofits or have their own nonprofits. And so you're able to provide speech therapy services in that way. But one way that I think that like some SLPs think about, but not as much, is our role of just sharing about our services. I think there's a lot of misconception about what we do as SLPs. A lot of times, regardless of the system that you're working in, we are like put in this very narrow box of you only do these things. And so people aren't really understanding that like, no, we don't just do one or two things. We do a lot of different things and how they really impact communication as a whole. So just even thinking about communities, like making sure that we know what SLPs do and being accessible to people to kind of ask those questions, even if it's not always because they're a direct client of ours, but just kind of being accessible to share a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Nobody ever asks what the physical therapist does. I mean, you know why you're going to a physical therapist, but yet most times when people are like, oh, you should go see an SLP, they're like, but I talk fine. I don't need this service. Leave me alone. It's like, actually, maybe we could benefit a little bit.
We know that you have a really important role in the community. And also, you know, most importantly, I think for the purpose of our conversation today, in schools. So Melissa, I know you are going to ask a question about that. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I mean, that's the question. Like what is the role of the SLP in a school? But I think some of the questions we'll want to dig into and probably ask you some follow-up questions around are around like, what kinds of tests are you giving to students? Do you diagnose anything? I think we'll keep asking you more questions, but you get started.
Let's dig deep in.
Questions.
So SLPs in the schools, I think, are one of my favorite population of people to talk to because they are really like the jacks of all trades in our field. I purposely have really gone into a specialization of where I'm either seeing kids with hearing loss or I'm seeing kids with dyslexia, and a little bit of like processing disorder. But like SLPs in the schools are really like a catch-all. And we know that they are because we have child fine through school systems where it's the responsibility of the schools to find kids that are considered delayed with their academic skills. And that could be with speech and language as well. And so they go through the IEP process to be considered eligible. Eligibility criteria, we know it varies district to district. We, I never tell people like, this is exactly what it needs to be, just because depending on where you live, that may not be accurate. So SLPs help with the evaluation side of that. And then from there, if a child qualifies for speech and language services, then they would develop goals and work with them in a group setting or one-on-one. But then they also even work with like the preschool kids. So we know that schools also serve preschools within special education. And so SLPs are generally a part of that team for eligibility if a child's going to qualify for special education preschools to really kind of go through and see. So it's really, it's so cool to be in the schools though, because in private practice, unless I am asked by the family or unless like the kid is in like a charter or private school, they're generally seeing me in my office or virtually. But when you're in the schools, like, yes, you have the speech room, which has the games and the fun and the glitz and the glam, right? But you also get to do direct push-in to help with generalization. You can do push-in to the classroom. You can get creative with your push-in and even do some push-in into recess or into lunch, kind of, whatever fits within your schedule. So you're really able to collaborate a lot with the people within your space to make your therapy impactful.
Yeah. Can you help us understand what that looks like? Like say let's just go with pushing in as the most recent example that you just gave. What does that look like? What would you sit there with the student? Would you be listening for certain things based on their goals? Like what happens in that push in setting?
So I think it really depends on what you're working on. I know that I've really enjoyed when I do push in with kids where if they're in small group, then I'm kind of sitting there and help guiding them. So sometimes the SLP might be sitting right next to them. Sometimes it might be more of that observation, kind of seeing what they're doing in the classroom. Sometimes it could even be, depending on the school, co-teaching something with the classroom teacher. That's a little bit harder in the public school setting just because of the nature of the way things are set up. But with enough planning and structure around it, you could be able to do that. So it just really depends on what you're working towards. But there's plenty of ways that you can get creative with push-in services.
All right, Sydney, so I'm going to ask you a question as a parent, a real one. So I have a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, and you can, as he's gaining speech, there are letters that he said, like specifically one that he does is the Y, like the sound for Y, the y sound. Mm-hmm. He replaces with an L, right? So for yellow, he says lello. In my mind, I'm like, he's 3. And I'm wondering as a parent, I know this is a question most parents probably think, when do you want to advocate? Like, when's the line when you're like, okay, I'm going to wait and see if this just changes, or mm-hmm. when's the time when I should reach out to an SLP or, to my school to see about getting a referral to an SLP? Like when should that happen as a parent? What's your recommendation?
Put me on the spot. So that one is twofold, I guess. I am personally not a believer in waiting and seeing. I think when we wait and see, then that's when we sit there and we really see kids struggle. So if you're a parent and you're concerned, I think that parents' concerns are always valid, even if you go and it pans out that like the professional says, oh, you know what, I think it's fine. It's always good to go get your peace of mind checked out, because what if it isn't? And then you've waited 6 months, a year, 2 years, and now we're dealing with compounding issues because we know that everything kind of builds on each other. So the first thing I always say is if you as a parent are saying, I'm not really sure about this. I want to check it out. It's always worth a conversation with your child's pediatrician if they're not in school. If they are in school, it's always worth that conversation with the teacher to just kind of address that. The other thing is there's so many resources that are free online that people just don't know about. So there's one, like we have norms that come out about when we expect kids to have certain speech sounds mastered. And so I want to say like new ones came out in 2020, I believe. And they like these are specifically geared to the US and US consonant structures. And so that's a really good resource. They even have like pretty infographics. So if you ever want one as like a teacher or as an SLP, they are available free on the web. But those tell you kind of like around 2. These are the sounds that we would expect, around 3, around 4, around 5. And so those, since those are available kind of publicly, then you can kind of use those as a check mark as a parent. Now, does that mean every kid is going to hit that exactly? No. But it gives you a guide. And then what we know is like having extra practice and somebody modeling like correct pronunciations is not going to be detrimental to a child.
Yeah. Sydney, I love that advice. I love also the idea of being proactive versus reactive. That's super helpful. I will share my daughter. I had that same experience as Melissa with different letters and sounds with her when she was about, I think, just under 3. She had to be just under 3. And I did exactly what you just said. I went online, I looked up like general speech norms or general speech milestones, found them, and was like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm going to call my local child find. And at that time, they came and they did an assessment and they said, she's okay for now. But if you do the assessment once she turns 3, I guess it was like the marker, she will qualify. So in a couple months, I called again. They did the assessment again, but I guess because she had aged up, then she qualified. And they started services right away. But it was really helpful to have that marker of like, okay, I'm feeling affirmed as a parent that I noticed this thing. I got it checked out. I got it assessed. And I realized, okay, if I call again really soon, she's going to qualify and get services more immediately. It was nipped in the bud before she even hit first grade. Like I think she was dismissed from services. She got services through pre-K and then I think I just kind of pushed for them to stay into kindergarten. And then before the spring of kindergarten, she was dismissed. So I think I love that idea of being proactive versus reactive and really as a parent trusting your instinct to have something checked out for your child. I mean, I think that's great. Very sound advice in all areas of parenting and in life, but really helpful here too when it's something that just feels like confusing as a parent. It almost feels like one more thing. And you're like, what is this developmentally appropriate? Is it not? I'm not sure. It's cute the way they say whatever, right? Like yellow, like Melissa just said. So it's hard to know.
Well, and you can't know all things, right? Like that's why we have people that's their area of specialization. But I think the biggest thing is like parents know their kids way better than we do. I'll tell anybody that. You can bring me a kid. I have the clinical knowledge and I have to get to know your kid, but I'm still only with them for just a short amount of time when we know that kids spend like, I think it's 80% or close to it of their time with caregivers or parents, whatever that looks like for their family situation. And they're with teachers and providers that other 20% of the time. It's a really small amount of time. Whereas the rest of the heavy duty is coming in from the family. So you can't ever, in my opinion, just flat out dismiss parental concerns because you have way more experience and time around this kid than I ever will doing an assessment or even if I'm treating them.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So supportive of families too. So thank you. If SLPs are in schools, what can they diagnose? How does this process work? Like if I'm a looking out from the outside, like if I'm looking from the outside in to a school, what happens if there are some concerns for my child?
Yeah. So I think that there's important like breakdowns that need to happen. So in a school setting, SLPs generally are diagnosing things related to speech and language concerns pretty much strictly. When we're looking at literacy, when we're looking at dyslexia, the SLP might be a part of the evaluation process, but they're not going to be the one that's providing that final diagnosis if that's what we're looking for. If you're working with somebody in the private setting, depending on their state laws and legislations, then you might have an SLP that's able to diagnose your child with dyslexia. So understanding that, like, since our scope of practice as an SLP is so vast, it's sometimes hard when we're like, but the SLP can do this. It's like, just because they can doesn't necessarily mean that that's within their scope of clinical competence. So it's not that it's not in their practice. Yes, it's in your scope of practice, but maybe it's not in your scope of competence. It's not something you feel good about. It's not something that you do on a daily. And so I think that's something that we've been seeing a lot more of, is there are a lot of SLPs in the school settings that are trying to educate themselves about literacy beyond just phonological awareness, understanding the language underpinnings, but recognizing that, like, our training programs for speech pathologists are really trying to cram all of this information for across our scope of practice into 2, maybe 3 years. And then people are going into settings where they just they're not getting all of that training. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time. So I always caution people, like, extend grace and kindness to your school-based SLP, because they may not know. That just may not be something that they have a lot of experience with.
I think that was such a good point you brought up, even when we talked prior to this conversation, because, it just didn't hit me until you said it. And I'm thinking, like, as a teacher, we're trained fairly specifically, and we still don't get all that we need in our training for that fairly specific grade band. But, as we said, birth to 125, is that what we landed on?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the way we're saying it now, Melissa. I'm going to look up the oldest person in the world's age, and we're going to go with that. So you continue on with 125 until further notice.
But there's no way that you can, be trained for every speech and language issue that might come up for everyone at all of those ages. There's just no way. So when you said, like, you specialize in dyslexia, that doesn't mean that every speech language pathologist does and has the knowledge they need necessarily. But, they might, and they might be able to get it, but they might not at the moment. It's just a really good point. All right, I'm ready to dig into a next topic. Are you all ready?
Let's do it.
Really excited for it.
Go ahead.
So I think it's so easy for people to put speech language over here. They go to the speech language pathologist down the hall over here, and then you have reading in the classroom over here. And Sydney, I know you are a big proponent of, like, there is so much overlap between, students are having difficulties with speech and language. It's going to show up in their reading. And I would love to hear your take on that, and we can just keep talking about it.
Yeah. Oh, man. This is what I mean, like, when people get put into boxes. So most times in a lot of settings, especially schools, SLPs are really just, like, put into that box of, like, you address the articulation, but how dare you mention anything about reading? Like,
that's not your lane.
Yeah. How dare you? You don't understand reading. You're not a reading specialist. But yeah, when you talk to the reading specialist, what do they talk about? The language underpinnings. What do SLPs do? They work on language. So actually you might know a little bit more than we're giving people credit for. And so that's where it starts. I actually just had a really good conversation with a researcher this morning where that's what we talked about, is we have to get people to understand the connections between language and literacy. It's not enough to just understand how to do reading instruction and good reading instruction. That's super important. But if we have kids with weak language skills, if we have kids who are having some type of difficulty with pronunciations, then we are still not doing right by these kids when it comes to reading instruction. And it's not even just kids that are using what we like called General American English or Standard American English, however people want to classify it now. Even looking at our kids with dialects, how much do we understand about dialectal differences in conversation, and how are those showing up within reading, within prompts? We have to know these things, and we have to know them well. It is not enough just to understand the science of reading and say, I understand SOR. That's great. Do we understand brain function? Do we understand those foundational skills? And that's something that when people send me emails and they're like, just tell me which reading programs I need to use. Tell me which trainings I should go to. The first thing I always say is like, well, what's your foundation? Well, I just want to know so I can do it. And it's like, no, you can't build a house on a weak foundation. Well, you can. You can build a house on a weak foundation.
Not going to go well.
It's going to collapse. And so we need to make sure that SLPs are building that strong foundation. You have the language there. You just have to understand how it connects to reading.
Yeah. And when you were talking, I was thinking like, I had my son in mind, right? With he's maybe hearing or saying the sound, the L and the Y sound, right? It's getting mixed up, right? So I'm thinking like, okay, when it goes to start reading and writing, that's where it might cause a problem, right? Is like we're trying to teach him what these letters represent, what sounds they represent, and he's having trouble hearing and saying them. And it just hit me when you were talking that like that's the same as our dialect. Like even I know that there's some words in my Eastern Pennsylvania dialect that when I grew up we called it a crick, right? And so when I saw the word creek, it's true though.
It's true. I know.
When I saw the word creek spelled CREEK, I was like, what is that? Like, what is this whole other word that I don't know about?
Right.
I'm thinking of growing up in South Jersey. I'm thinking of how we said water, which was
I have that same one.
Yeah, yeah.
Water.
Yeah.
I was like WOODER. But it's the way you say it is how it's
well, that's
spelled,
how you're hearing
right?
it, right?
That's how I'm
you
visualizing
hear
it too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
so connected. Mm-hmm.
It really is. Like I am a proud African-American English user in my personal life. And I grew up in the South. So I have influences of both. And sometimes I'll say, oh yeah. So sometimes I'll say things. I'm like, wait, what? That's not, or like I can tell somebody else did not pick up on that. But it does, my spelling sometimes, like I really have to think about it because the way that I pronounce the word is not necessarily exactly how it's spelled. So there are some like phonological influences that happen. But even like our language structure, I mean, the way that I might put a sentence together or the syntax or the vocabulary that I'm using is going to be very, very different depending on the setting. And so it doesn't mean that like a kid doesn't necessarily know some vocabulary. It may be that like that is different than the vocabulary that they use at home. And that's okay. We have different vocabularies that we use in different settings, and there is nothing wrong with that.
For sure. Can you give an example? Like, can you get not, from your personal life, but maybe of a student that we might see, and then maybe how we would address that? Like as a teacher, how could I respectfully share with a student? It's not crick.
Stop laughing at me, Lori.
I'm sorry. I'm only laughing because I've never heard you say that. It's just I can't imagine you saying it, so it's really funny to me. Help Melissa self-correct that. Just kidding.
Y'all are too funny. So I've actually been having these conversations with Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, who is at FSU a lot recently because we're working on a project together. And so we want to make sure that we are not correcting students and saying like your dialect is wrong and my dialect is right. Right. And so like something that she's used and that she's gotten from research is talking about like using clothing as an example. So, like sometimes we might wear a dress. Sometimes we might wear shorts and a t-shirt. Sometimes we might wear like the full tux. And you can wear those different things to different places, but it's going to shape, how we're using our language and things like that. But when I have kids that produce things a little bit differently, I don't really harp on it if you still understand the meaning of it. Because I know that, like you say, like I say water, I don't say water with like King's English, but like the meaning is still the same. So I think it's even the same in the classroom. If you have kids that are saying things a little bit differently, or even if their vocabulary is slightly different than how you would phrase it as a teacher, if it's not impacting them academically, or if it's not impacting the concept that's being taught, then you can really let it go. It's okay. You can let it go. It's fine. Or if it is impacting it, you can just say like, oh, you know what? We are talking about, let's say the word is puddle or whatever. We're talking about puddle. It's not a whatever somebody else might call it. This is a puddle, and then define it and go through it that way. So really making sure that like it's tying back without discounting the other person's experience and what they're bringing to the table.
Can I just tell you my absolute favorite posts on the Facebook group, What I Wish I Learned in College, Science of Reading, What I Wish I Learned in College, are the ones where someone will say, how many phonemes are in whatever word? Doesn't matter what the word is, right? Whatever word. How many phonemes are in this word? I will read the entire comment section because we have people from all over the United States, different countries, and people are like, you say that word like that? And I love it because I think it's just like, oh, like, yeah, we actually legitimately do say words differently depending on where we live. And it's okay because if you say it, there's only one way. Then you go home and you hear still everyone around you is saying it the way that you've always heard it. Like to hear that that's wrong is, it's like, we're always going to say water here in Philadelphia area. It's just not going to change. But I love those posts. They're like pure joy for me.
Yeah, those are pretty good. I like them too.
Melissa, if you find one, can you, we'll have to look for one to link
I'll
here
tag one
in the show notes for sure. Then everybody will be joining that Facebook group and be like, oh yeah,
it is
200
just so
comments
fun.
later.
And you're like, oh my gosh, like in Australia, that's how they say that. That's so crazy.
It is so interesting. Yeah, for sure. Oh my gosh. Well, Sydney, I'm wondering if you have any pieces of advice for teachers out there listening to this. We know we have a huge teacher audience, and I think this is a great opportunity for an SLP to talk directly to our teachers who are working with, lots of students who may need some SLP support every day in the classroom.
Yes. Well, first off, I want to say, like, I love teachers. One of my best friends from college is a teacher. She just got her master's in reading instruction. And so the amount of love and dedication that you guys pour into teaching, I think is truly remarkable, especially from what we've seen over the past couple of years with how challenging it's been to stay in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So first off, just kudos to all the teachers that are out there and listening. And then the second thing is lean into your resources. It does not have to be a battle of like the SLP versus the classroom teacher, or the classroom teacher versus the reading interventionist, or versus administration. One thing that I have always benefited from in my career is the amount of interprofessional collaboration and learning how to work with other people. And that does not always mean that you agree. There are plenty of people that I've worked with in my career that I love and admire. And I still sometimes am like, you know what? I don't really agree with that line of thinking, or that's just not how I would do something. Mm-hmm. But it's okay. You don't always have to agree, but we're all working for the common good. And the common good is to help these kids that we have in our classrooms to be successful. So if you have an SLP in your school building, get to know them and then find out what their strengths and weaknesses are. I challenge SLPs that are listening to be honest about that. I think sometimes we are touted as professionals about having to know all the things, and it's uncomfortable to say that that is not in my wheelhouse. But be honest with the people within your school and tell them, like, I would love to support you with this. I don't know a lot about it, but I'd love to learn with you. I think people respect the honesty when you say that I don't know, but I'm willing to go and learn with you, versus when you try to say like, oh, I know all the things, and then, like you're stumbling. So don't do that. And then, like I said, with the teachers, just really leaning into what you have available. We know that resources are scarce. We know that there's hardships. Like those things are not new in education. I feel like they've maybe been amplified, but they're not new. So just really realizing how you can work with the students, and then it might take a little bit of extra research on your own. But I feel like once you kind of understand that knowledge, that's something you take with you. Nobody can take that from you.
Sydney, you mentioned on our pre-call about a research study, and I think we'll just underline the need for the collaboration, especially with speech-language pathologists, reading specialists, teachers, about the connection between speech and reading. Do you want to talk a little about it?
Yeah, so I found this study. I think it got published in 2020, but it was like 25% of kids that were receiving school-based services for speech sound disorders or articulation, as some people may know it as, were at risk for reading difficulties. And the same kids that were at risk at the beginning of the year were also at risk at the end of the year. So we know that there's influence of articulation. We just have to figure out how we can, be beneficial and provide instruction across settings. It's not good enough for somebody to just go to speech for 30 minutes, 2 times a week, 1 time a week. But if you as the classroom teacher can use what you have to reinforce those things. And the nice thing is it's beneficial for everybody. Right. It's not just beneficial for this one kid that needs it. They may be your target, but all kids benefit from that direct explicit instruction with how to produce sounds. Even if they haven't mastered, it's not going to be detrimental to them.
Such a good point. Thank you. Cindy, is there anything else you wanted to mention about the community and the impact that SLPs can have in the community?
I don't think so. That is where my heart lives. I think that there are so many amazing resources. That's why I love your podcast. I mean, even though it's a podcast, like it's still a free and accessible resource. And you guys have brought on some big names within the literacy space that have shared some precious gems for people. Just realizing that like we have the information. We know that the information about structured reading has been out for decades. There's no need for us to gatekeep it. We should just make it available in whatever way that feels authentic to you. I love being on social media. I have loved growing my profile. I love getting on Canva and making my infographics to share with people. That is like a form of stress release for me, surprisingly. But other people don't want to do that. They don't want to dedicate their time to that. That's too much. And that's fine. So figure out what works for you. It doesn't have to be the Sydney method. It doesn't have to be Melissa and Lori and create a podcast. It could just be something small. It could be local. It could just be with the people that you interact with on a daily. But that's your decision and your choice to make about how you can be impactful in your community.
We love that. Well, we're so glad that you're here. And I think we have some really fun questions to wrap it up, some rapid fire. I don't think we even prepared you for this. So
you didn't. So.
We didn't. Hold on to your hat.
Coming at you.
Well, if you've listened to the end of other ones, then you might be prepared. So we have 4 questions for you, just whatever comes to mind. This is not a test.
Okay.
First question is, what do you love to read?
Ooh. Okay, I really like children's books. That's terrible.
It's not.
I find the stories now are just so like different than I feel like the books that I had growing up, and the creativeness of these authors just it always surprises me. So I love reading children's books, and then I've been doing like a lot more listening to articles and things like that versus sitting down and like reading them.
I'm still considering that reading. So
okay. Well,
I mean,
there we go. Then we are reading.
We're doing a whole lot of reading. All right. Question 2. What do you love to watch?
Oh man. Okay. So, I love junk TV. It's really, really bad. So Big Brother just ended last night, and shout out to Taylor Hale, who is the first Black woman winner of Big Brother. Homegirl went through a whole lot this season, but she prevailed. So I love anything reality TV. But Big Brother was like my thing this summer. I've watched Love is Blind, Real Housewives.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I'm with you. So fun.
And then Law and Order. I'm like a Law and Order fanatic. It's pretty bad. That's what I have on while I work.
At night after that? That's what I want to know.
I watch it during the day, and it's like just kind of on in the background while I'm working. But yeah, no, I don't like the gruesome stuff. Just like give me the drama.
That is so funny. I love it.
I didn't even know Big Brother was still on. That's been on for a long time.
It has.
All right, what do you love to listen to?
Ooh, so I love listening to podcasts now. I used to not really like podcasts at all, but I've really enjoyed, there's one that just ended earlier this year called Evidence and Argument in CSD, which featured 2 SLPs on there. I really loved that. And then I'm like a huge music person. So like 90s, 2000s will always be a ride for me. And then recently I've been listening to Renaissance by Beyonce. I finally made time to dedicate to sit down and just enjoy. And it has been a wonderful experience. I have enjoyed this album over the past week.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've done that, where there's one album that I want to listen to the whole thing. And I need to do that. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of not hard, but you have to intentionally do it, I think, now, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in other things while you're on an app. It's not like you put the CD on and
exactly. That's you don't buy the CD and listen to the whole thing. Right. Yeah.
Could you all, total sidebar, but can you all in your heads remember when you listen to a song still today, can you hear the next song on the CD?
Yeah.
I can still remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. For a few. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the ones you listen to over and over again. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you have to get to that point with Beyonce, Sydney.
Oh, it's already happened. It's already happened.
That's a very good point.
Her transition. So fun fact, I'm a huge bandy, and I did marching band for 8 years of my life. I did 4 years in high school, and then I marched 4 years at the University of South Carolina. And so I will forever stand good music with great transitions. And this album is beautiful. It just flows from one song to the other so seamlessly. It's you can't help but to listen nicely.
Oh, I love it.
So
well, I feel
you really
we should tag some people in this podcast. We should definitely be tagging Beyonce. Definitely be tagging the Big Brother winner.
All the shout outs today, right?
All right. We're bringing it home. Why do you do what you love? For education, or for literacy, or for your community? I think we can open it up.
Oh, man. Oh, wow. I was not expecting this question. Okay. So I think the first reason for why I do this work is because I know the family impact of it. My brother is almost 8 years younger than me. So I was very much so aware of the experiences that he was going through as he was going through them. So that is always stuck with me and been something that holds dear and true to my heart. And then even when I got to work clinically and started working clinically, to see the impact of families when they realized that they had a provider that cared for them, when they realized that there was a provider that was not just willing to work with their kid, but was willing to go to bat with the family and make sure that they felt fully educated and informed, is something that still is really impactful for me. And then for my community, you cannot be successful without community influence. Our communities shape every aspect, whether you think they don't or not, they do. When people understand and know about why things are happening in their community. They're able to make better informed decisions. And that is how we help to create better health equity, because literacy is a part of public health. And whether people want to realize that or not, like, it's a part of your health, it's a part of your wellness. So being able to understand that, like, when we do small things within our classroom, the overall impact is so much bigger than what we're seeing within those students. And you never know what people are carrying home with them either.
So important. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this whole conversation.
Oh, thank you guys. I'm like getting choked up talking about my why, but I have appreciated being here so much.
Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday. Sign up to stay connected with us at literacypodcast.com.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast in this episode are not necessarily the opinions of Gray Minds PBC or its employees.